Welcome back to our series on J.L. Austin's book, How to Do Things with Words. And this is part 3 of our series, so if you're just jumping in, it may be a good idea to go back and watch the other previous videos. But in this video, we're going to talk about chapter 4 of this particular book. And as Austin talks about performative language, he is now going to deal with, in this chapter, sincerity, the question of sincerity. So if we look at this kind of picture here, we have what Austin increasingly calls the total speech act. And what he means by that is not just simply what I say. So let's say I say, I do when I get married. Okay, and we call that a speech act because we're doing an action through words as opposed to simply describing something. That would be called a constative. Let's say I say there's a rhinoceros over there. That is probably closer to a constative. So we have a performative here, and there has to be a bunch of conditions for that performative to work. So I have to be the right person to say that in the marriage ceremony. I have to say it to somebody, and so on and so forth. Now, all of those conditions Austin had dealt with already in chapter 3 and even before that. And in chapter 4, he really starts to deal with this question of sincerity. What do I believe about this? Earlier, he called these the gamma cases. Okay, so these are the gamma cases. And the question of sincerity has two parts. First of all, I have to be sincere in my thoughts. And then I also have to follow through later on in terms of actually doing the thing that I promise or that I set out to do. If one of these two things fails, then we talk about an abuse or a breach of sincerity. So that's basically what this chapter is about. What does sincerity mean? And increasingly you can see that the total speech act is starting to widen, it's starting to broaden. There's more and more that we need to take into account to see if the speech act is happy or if it's void. Void means it doesn't work, and happy means that the conditions are all met. So that's great and seems pretty straightforward, but the chapter is quite difficult, and actually I would suggest you read all the way through to chapter 5, because at the beginning of that chapter he nicely summarizes some of the things he has been saying. So the major question that's kind of in Austin's mind as he writes this chapter is, as we look at sincerity, can we still see overlap with constatives, with descriptive statements? And there are two ways in which we can think about that overlap. So the one has to do with whether statements are true or false, and then the other thing has to do with the logic of statements. And we'll have a look at both of those as we go through this. Now, let's zoom in a little bit here and think about this question of sincerity. Austin suggests that when we think about our thoughts, there are kind of three typical ways in which we can think about a speech act. So we can have feelings. He calls these feelings. Let's say I congratulate you, right? That's a kind of action. I'm doing the action of wishing you well. So I congratulate. Then I'm feeling something about that. Do I really feel happy for you that it's your birthday? Well, maybe not. Then we also have thoughts, and this would be something like, I advise you to, and maybe I'm advising you to do something that I actually don't believe is a good idea. Well, if my intentions aren't sincere, is it still a proper speech act? And Austin has some doubts about that. And then the last one here has to do with intentions. So intentions, let's say I bet that I will do this. I'm going to jump off a bridge or something like that. And not to commit suicide, obviously. So I say I bet, and I actually don't follow through. Well, you can see that this has more to do with the question over here. Am I actually going to do the thing that I promised? So we see three elements of sincerity, and Austin suggests that this creates a certain variety, and it also creates certain problems, right? How do we limit the scope of sincerity? Is it just what I think, or is it also what I do? Do I have to be sincere? Does it really matter? Can the speech act still be effective? So those are some interesting questions that he raises early on in the chapter. Now, as he goes on, he kind of focuses on a few sample problems that interest him. And the first is, if I'm mistaken in my thoughts. So, for instance, I say that somebody is not guilty. If I'm, let's say, a member of the jury, somebody's not guilty, and I'm actually mistaken because the person is guilty. Well, that's a speech act, but is it void because of what the kind of external reality is? Again, interesting question. Similarly, if I give bad advice, but I really did have sincere intentions. So I'm telling you to go to this particular school, and it's not really the right school for you, but I don't really know that. Related to both of these kind of categories are what Austin increasingly calls verdictives. And verdictives are statements where we make a verdict, where we say, well, this person is guilty, or this is true, or if you're an umpire, let's say in a baseball game, that player is out, let's say. That kind of thing is a verdictive. And we'll come back to that in a second, because that does seem to bring in again this question of true or false. Is the person really out? Is the person really guilty? Right? Those things have to do with true or false, it seems. And then the last thing, and we've talked about this already to some extent, is if I make a performative, does the subsequent action actually matter? So let's say I sell my vehicle to you, and I actually don't go through with the sale. What if I don't follow up? All very interesting questions, and it raises this issue of, well, how limited is the speech act? What if I promise to do something next year, a long ways away? Do we have to wait all the way till I actually perform the action, finally complete it, to kind of say, well, this was a proper speech act? And it gets a bit ludicrous when you stretch it so broadly. Now, I want to come back to this issue of true or false now, because what you start to see is that we do have a kind of problem here, because if we look at these things, earlier Austin had said that speech acts have nothing to do with true or false. Okay, it has to do with action, and we can only talk about a speech act as being either effective or not, as being happy or unhappy in meeting its conditions. Whereas if I say, for instance, hey, there's a rhinoceros, then that's either true or false. You can actually take a look and see if it's true. But as we can see here, there is an element of true or false, it seems, because if I say somebody is not guilty, well, we can determine that, okay? And so we have to look at this question of true or false a little bit more closely yet. To get at this question of whether speech acts are true or false, Austin gives the example of the verb I apologize, or the speech act I apologize. And he says if we look at this closely, we can make 4 statements about this, and all of them have a true or false factor to them. So I can say, it is true that I am apologizing. That's happening. It is true that certain conditions are fulfilled, and these are A1 and A2 and so on. These are dealt with in a previous chapter, so I have to be the right person to apologize. You have to accept the apology and so on. Well, you don't have to accept it, but you have to be there to kind of be part of it. And it is true that I have sincere intentions. So that's the issue of sincerity that we've talked about. And lastly, it is true that I'm committed to future action. I'm going to follow through, as we said before. So does this mean then that speech acts can be considered true or false? Well, Austin says no. The difference is that it's the conditions that are true or false, the conditions that make the speech act possible that are true or false. It's not the speech act itself. Okay? So it's the conditions that are true or false. And what we can say then is that a speech act should be seen as doing something. Okay, we're doing something, and the speech act is either effective or not effective. Whereas a constative or a descriptive statement, constative, has more to do with saying or describing something. Saying or describing. So if we wanted to split them up, we could say, well, if you were describing the act of apologizing, you would say, I am apologizing. And grammatically speaking, we call that the present continuous. Whereas if you were doing something, you would say, I apologize. I apologize. And grammatically speaking, we call that the simple present. So that's the difference between the two. And in later chapters, Austin will keep coming back to this question of whether this grammatical form kind of signifies the constative as opposed to the simple present here, which signifies the performative. Okay, so that's kind of the distinction that he's trying to make here then. It seems like there's a true or false factor, but really the difference is between the conditions and the actual doing itself. Okay, and you can see that here. Here we're just describing I am apologizing, and that is either true or false, whereas here I apologize, that doesn't have quite as much to do with whether it's true or false. It's simply an action that I'm performing. All right, so that's one way to get at this, to think about this in relation to true or false. The other way to kind of follow up on this question of whether constatives and performatives overlap is to think about logic, to think about the logic of these kinds of statements and how they relate to either of these things. Okay? Is the logic of constatives similar to the logic of performatives? And that's the hardest part of the chapter, really. This is where Austin focuses on these last three statements, and he looks at the logic of each. So the first one has to do with this idea that something presupposes something else. One thing presupposes another thing. So let's take a statement here. And Austin's example is, he says, well, all Jack's children are bald. Okay, all Jack's children are bald. That's one statement. We can deduce other statements from that, but some statements that we might come up with after this might not actually work out very well. So let's say I also say Jack has no children. Jack has no children. The point here is that this doesn't really work. I cannot say Jack has no children. This is a statement that has no reference point because we've seen Jack. There he is. He's definitely bald. We'll give him a smiley face. There he is. And all his children are bald as well. So there's no way in which this statement makes sense. And because it has no reference point, we cannot even talk about a true or false, really, dichotomy here. Instead, it has more to do with being void. It's simply a statement that makes no sense. We can't measure if it's true or false, or it's not even in that kind of realm. And what you see here then is that these are really constatives. These are descriptive statements, and yet they don't quite fit the true or false distinction. They seem to have more to do with being void. They seem to be somewhat similar to performatives. So that's very interesting because the logic overlaps a little bit. Then we have the third one here. And the third one has to do with something implying something else. One thing implies another. And often the implication has to do with belief. Okay? So let's say I say the cat is on the mat. The cat is on the mat. There we go. There's our statement. Then even though this is a descriptive statement, I'm just describing what I see, presumably I have some kind of belief that there is a cat on the mat. Why else would I say it? So belief, we have seen, is an aspect of performative statements. I believe that I'm going to do something, or if I say, for instance, I promise, right, then I should believe that I'm going to keep my promise. Well, belief seems to be also part of constative statements, so that's very interesting as well. And then the last one here, it is true that I am committed to future action. This one has to do with what he calls the logic of entailment. One thing entails another. So, for instance, if I say the cat is on the mat, if we come back to this example, then that entails that I cannot say the cat is not on the mat. Or I cannot say the cat is not under the mat, right? One statement kind of entails another one. And that sense of entailing, where one thing limits our options in the future for saying something else or doing something else, that's also similar to speech acts. Because if I say, I promise, then that entails something. That entails I ought. Okay? One statement entails another. One speech act also entails some other kind of action. So what we have seen then, looking back at this big mess here, is that when we think about constitutives and speech acts, there is some overlap. It's very difficult to keep them apart because, first of all, the true or false distinction, we have to be very careful about making a distinction between the conditions and the actual speech act. And then secondly, the logic of these two things often has a lot of similarity. That's basically what chapter 4 is about. And it's very open-ended because Austin is not saying, well, now we have resolved everything. Rather, he's just kind of exploring these questions of whether constitutives and performatives do overlap and whether these distinctions hold in the long run. And as we go on in future videos and we talk about future chapters or later chapters, we'll see if indeed the distinctions do hold.